Today, I'm talking to Rebecca Lee, and her book is How Words Get Good, the story of making a book. I absolutely loved this book. Rebecca is a professional word improver, and she talks about how a book gets from an author's brain to a finished book. She also covers a whole range of fascinating topics, including ghostwriters, typesetting, why certain words end up in books, footnotes, endnotes, covers, everything. And she also covers some really interesting stories about the history of hyphens and end dashes and ellipses and so on. So let's have a chat with the absolutely fascinating Rebecca Lee. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me, Valerie.
I love your book so much. How Words Get Good. I couldn't put it down. I've emailed so many people saying, you've got to read this book. Oh my God, I think you're going to love this book. Now, for readers who haven't got a copy of the book yet, tell us what it's about.
Okay, so I was asked to write this book by someone I used to work with, is the kind of really boring, prosaic answer of how the book came to be. But I think from my point of view and based on my career, I've worked at Penguin Random House for about 20 years. I've been a sort of point of connection between authors and then all the behind the scenes work that goes into making a book. So I thought there was something in the notion of challenging the idea of the writing a book being a sort of lonely solo endeavor, because actually it's a huge collective team effort. But I wouldn't want readers to think that I know everything there is to know about publishing. So the book was really a kind of journey for me in finding out about what all these fantastic people did, all the indexers, all the cover designers, all the blurb writers. And I think with books, we're so used to them as objects, but we don't think very much about how they come to be. And I think really, like, when it comes down to it, I hope readers will feel about this book in the same way that I do, which is that we're all a bit crazy about books. And there's lots of really fun, interesting stories about how books come to be.
There are so many fun and interesting stories. I think that and you listeners, you just have to go and get this book because they're so interesting, they're so worthwhile, and a lot of them you wouldn't have heard of. Now, what happened when somebody said to you, hey, are you interested in writing this book? Because you work in the publishing industry, but had you thought of writing a book of this nature before? What did you think?
I thought total panic, because it was very, very flattering to be asked, but I had never considered myself to be an author. You know, I spent my days, I mean, there's probably something quite ironic in this. I spent my days correcting other people's writing. That's how I saw myself. And so to put myself on the other side of that process was quite a big leap to take in my mind. So I was very unsure that I would be able to do this. And I think it probably turned into a slightly different book to the one my editor originally intended. I think she perhaps was looking for something more about the rules of grammar, or, you know, how sentences are constructed, which, you know, there's lots of fantastic books out there about that kind of thing. But I'm afraid my mind is much more like digging down into rabbit holes of fun stories and having a slightly, I hope, entertaining and humorous take on books.
Oh, absolutely. So you can tell that you did a lot of research for this book, and it's absolutely fascinating. But how did you then go to the editor and say, oh, it's kind of morphed into something else?
Well, so I was very lucky. I had a 4-month sabbatical actually during the first lockdown here in the UK. So I headed off to sort of get my head around the book and how I thought I could structure it and start doing some research and doing some writing. And I originally started out with a sort of A to Z concept. But then I sort of changed that into a beginning with like covers and finishing with indexes, so kind of mirroring the physical properties of the book. I wrote the first draft, and then my editor and I, she looked at it and she didn't like the structure at all, which was it's a very challenging point for an author when you spent so much time writing something and you sort of feel like that's the only way it can exist. And she was like, no, that's not working. And that's when we came up with this 3-part structure that the book now follows, which is kind of more thematic, and I think works a lot better. So I think what I'm trying to say here is the role of the commissioning editor in publishing is quite difficult to define, but it's absolutely invaluable, because when you're a writer and you're that close to the text and that's sort of emotionally invested in it, it's impossible for you to put yourself in the shoes of a reader and to think, is this helping the reader to understand what I want to say here? So having an editor, having all these other pairs of eyes on your work is really important.
So did you write it in that sabbatical, the first draft anyway, and did you not have to do any of your day job during that time?
I had my 4 month sabbatical, and I wrote the first draft. Then we had this sort of backwards and forwards about the structure of the book, which took quite a few months to resolve. I mean, one thing I should emphasize about publishing is it moves at the pace of a glacier. It's very slow. Generally, for lots of reasons. Yes. You have to have a lot of patience and a lot of stamina to stick with it. So we had some backwards and forwards about restructuring the book, and obviously I was back at work by then, so finding time to restructure it was quite tricky. I did all that. My editor then moved on to another publisher, so I sort of began the process of and so she looked at the text and did a sort of line by line edit with me, which was actually really, really helpful. And then eventually, I mean, by this point, as an author, you're completely exhausted. The book went into copy editing. So the sort of bit of my day job that I work on. And it was really interesting, because I like to think that previously I was, empathetic towards my authors and the work they're having to do. But I think being an author myself now has made it even more clear to me that you write this book, you put it all out there, it can be quite intense, and you just want a bit of a break. But no, then the text comes back to you from your copy editor, which I must say, I didn't enjoy being copy edited. And that's not because my copy editor wasn't brilliant. She was fantastic. But it's like having your homework given back to you. There's all these corrections you've got to consider. There's all these kind of things you have to respond to. So it was another layer and another sort of 6 weeks of like very intense engagement with the text. But I got through that. And then we went to page proofs, which is actually lovely, because then it starts to look like a book. Yes. So page proofs, indexing, and then we did, several rounds of corrections. So in all, Valerie, I think it took 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah, so, and that's not unusual.
Yes, but still.
Yeah, it's a long time.
So with this book then, did you, because you've been in the publishing industry for a couple of decades, so you already have a lot of knowledge about how the process works. And yet there was so much research clearly in this book, including the history of how certain things came about, the history of how some punctuation came about, research into ways other publishing houses or authors did certain things. How did you approach that research at the start? How did you even know what you were going to research? Or did you kind of just let yourself go down 50,000 rabbit holes and then curate the best bits?
I think I tried to start with the physical properties of the book. And so, for example, just doing something as basic as opening a book and looking at a page and thinking, well, why do we have footnote indicators that look like that? Why do we have running heads that look like that? What can we find out about how you put text on a page? And there's all these fantastic stories that sort of, I mean, a lot of it obviously dovetails with the history of print. Whole chapter on printing, and I was really lucky I got to go and visit a printer here in the UK, and it was absolutely brilliant. And for example, when I started writing the chapter on print, I realized that basically the history of print is the history of like Europe. It was such a profound social change that you could, and people have written entire books about the impact of mass printing on the whole of culture. So obviously I couldn't go that far into it, but there were all these stories that once you start unpicking them, when did we start having page numbers in books? When did we start having books that looked like books? Because originally you would have text printed on a scroll.
Yes.
But at some point that became a book. And so in some ways, I guess it's quite self-indulgent in that I let myself just go and find all these sort of fun stories. But I was also lucky because I work with lots of fantastically talented people. And so I could go and have interviews with them about what they were doing in their part of the publishing process. So, for example, there's a whole chapter in the book about blurbs. So the text that's on the back cover of a book, which the whole idea of it is to persuade people to buy the book. And I work with a fantastically brilliant copywriter, and it was just so interesting talking to her because her life is spent crafting these sort of 200 words. So they're very, very concise. Every word has to be meaningful. There's no room for any sort of redundancy. And so it's a real craft that she's honed over years of experience. And so as soon as I started thinking about these stories, it became clear that there was so much to kind of unpack and to understand why books are, published in the way that they are.
So the great thing about being in the industry, you can talk to somebody who writes blurbs, but there are so many stories that are historical. And I'd love to just unpack some of those to find out where you found out the stories. So let's take the one about, we used to write on scrolls, which is vertical. And you write in the book that at some point it became horizontal. And at some point, then someone got the bright idea of stitching the pages together so that you could write on both sides of the page, so to speak, and you could carry it around in kind of like a book, in book form. So, and I may not have got all of that right, so please do correct me.
You did great.
So where did you find out all of that, for example, as one story?
Okay, so I started, like any sensible person would, on the internet. On Wikipedia, like if you just look at if you put in publishing or printing or book, I began there. There is a bibliography in How Words Get Good, which so that will tell readers where I then went away and found. I spent like the first 3 weeks of my sabbatical just ordering books online for me to read. So it was fantastic because I very quickly discovered some fantastic resources that I could then take away and then do further research on. And it's really it's amazing. So for example, there's an academic out there who has written an entire book about ellipses, the dot that I talk about in the book. So I touch on it fairly briefly, but she has written, an entire book and based her sort of academic career on these three little dots and what they mean. So there are people out there who really, drill down into these tiny little points of interest. So I guess I had more of a magpie approach in that I wanted to cover a fair amount of ground. I couldn't write an entire book just about ellipses. Amazing how that would be. And I'm very glad to done so because, it's out there and it's fantastic. So it was a case of marshalling all of these kind of sources, doing lots of reading, doing lots of research, and then pulling together the most interesting stories that I could find.
One of the other stories you tell is, there's a chapter on ghostwriting, and you tell this story about syndicates and how Edward Strathmeyer, I think I've got the name right, who started the Rover Boys, but was also responsible for the Bobbsey twins and what were some of the others?
Well, so then you move on to things like Nancy Drew.
Yes.
That kind of
the Hardy Boys and all of that. So, and his publisher created this syndicate. Can you just tell listeners the concept of a syndicate and how it worked?
Yeah, I guess so. This is kind of I think it's probably in the 1930s in the States. And it was this idea that he'd come up with this sort of the concept, like the Bobbsey twins. But he basically employed a stable of sort of hack writers to churn out the books. And it was done to a really strict formula, so in terms of the number of words, the length of the first chapter, the language that could be used. And it's just a really interesting way of thinking about when I was a child, I used to love reading Enid Blyton books, and we look back on them now and think, well, they're not particularly great examples of storytelling, but they are, because they're very familiar, comforting worlds. And that's because they follow the same formula and the same pattern. And I think when we're children in particular, and you're learning to read, reading can be difficult. And so finding a way to read where you sort of know where the structure of the story is going to go is quite helpful. And that's why, you know, we still return to that when we're older as well. So the other person I talk about is Ian Fleming, the James Bond books, where there's a very clear structure that happens in every single one of the books. And we do like that, you know, there's this kind of like, it's easy to be kind of, you know, to think, well, this is not great writing because it just follows the same structure every time. But it's actually really reassuring for readers. They're little footholds and handholds that you can pull yourself through the text by.
And you also cover some elements of punctuation. And I was reading what you were talking about, the in dashes and the M dashes and the spaces. And I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I think. But but let's talk about the asterisk. Now, I did not know the history of the asterisk until I read it in your book. Can you tell listeners about how the asterisk came about, but also how did you find out that story?
So there was some amazing research done in Europe, so sort of paleoarchaeologists, and they were looking at cave paintings and cave markings around the whole of Europe. And they discovered that there were, I think, 32 signs and symbols that appeared over about 30,000 years and across the whole of Europe. And one of those symbols that kept popping up was the asterisk, this little star. And I love to think, like, you know, so this little star, it illuminates things that are important. So basically, since humans have been able to write or communicate by writing on walls, they've wanted to find a way to emphasize where something is really important. And the little star was the symbol that they chose, which is just so lovely, because if you think about it, it's like, you know, you obviously got stars up in the sky, and they thought, well, the way to highlight this story is to draw a little star next to it. And that is the story of the asterisk. It's just like, it is just amazing. It's this idea of it like shining a little extra light on something that the writer thinks is important.
Now, this book flows so well, and it's funny and it's fascinating. Why had you not thought of being an author before?
I think maybe I work with authors all the time, and I think I just never really saw myself in that role. I felt like I was, you know, my job was to kind of sweep up behind them and kind of work with them on refining what they were doing. And I'd never really considered that I could be an author. I have to say, once I started writing, I really enjoyed it. I surprised myself with how much I really enjoyed it. So I hope I'll get the opportunity to do some more. But it was a big leap of faith for me, like, you know, after 20 years, to suddenly change the way I thought of myself and my relationship with words. But it's been amazing, and partly because I can then really understand how my authors feel when I'm, you know, presenting them with another copy edited text or loads more queries. So yeah, it's been amazing.
So have you thought of, oh, if I wrote another book, it's going to be about X?
Well, okay, so my poor long-suffering partner, he's also a writer, but I tend to wake up in the mornings and say, well, I could write a history of offshore wind farms or a book about toads. This is honestly how my brain works, Valerie. And he looks at me sadly and says, why don't you just stick to what you know, see how this book does, and then perhaps think of some more ideas in the same kind of space, which is, of course, correct. I really must try and confine myself. But I am like, I love doing the research, and
yes.
I hope that shows in the book. You know,
it
that
absolutely does.
Diving down rabbit holes, because I think it's Richard Feynman, the physicist, who said, and I completely agree with this, everything is interesting once you go into it just a little bit. So it doesn't matter what it is in the world, everything. So, you know, as an example from the book, just taking the ellipses, those three little dots, why they came to be, how they came to be, how we use them. You know, there's lots of stories about just three little dots on a page, and the whole of books and words have all those stories once you start drilling down.
But the thing that a lot of other people love research and love the process of it, but when they often put too much of their research in the book, but you've managed to just distill the exact amount that is going to be utterly fascinating, but still feel whole for the reader. But let's go back to my original question, which was, have you thought about what book you're going to write next?
Well, at the moment, Valerie, I'm just trying to enjoy this book as well.
Fair enough.
I think it'd be quite easy to get onto the whole like, oh, what do I do next? And in some ways, that's quite a daunting question for me, because I was really, like I said, I was really lucky that someone came to me with the idea for this book and the title, and so it wasn't presented to me as a fully formed idea, but it was like, the editor felt that there was a market for the book, and that's a really like privileged position to be in as a writer, because often, usually for writers, they come up with an idea and then they have to write a proposal and go and find a publisher. So I was able to do it in a slightly backwards version. So I do have some ideas, but but maybe we'll think about it in the autumn once this is all calmed down, and try and confine myself to something within the sphere that I know quite a lot about, rather than just going off on a random segue into postcodes or pylons. But who knows?
Postcodes or pylons. So let's go back to when you were making your career choices, and you obviously didn't think, oh, I'm going to become an author. Had you always wanted to get into the publishing industry, or how did you get into the publishing industry? I was a very bookish child. It won't surprise you to learn. I remember, like, one of my earliest memories is actually falling downstairs because I was reading a Peter Rabbit book as I walked, which used to drive my parents insane. Like, I would literally make myself car sick by reading in the car. That was my devotion to reading. So I always, love books, and I love reading. But I went to university and did English and history. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I hadn't really thought about publishing as a career at that point. And I did a couple of years of sales, working on a student magazine. And while I was working on the magazine, I actually got much more interested in how it was put together. So the whole production process, and that taught me a lot. So I decided to then go and do a 6-month publishing course here in the UK, which just covered everything. I mean, it had quite a heavy emphasis on print, actually. So I did that, and I got some work experience as part of that. And I was really lucky. So my CV ended up at Penguin, and they recruited me initially as an assistant temporary production controller for a 3-month job. So it was a pretty low-level entry position, but it was Penguin. And once I was there, I was able to I was in production for a couple of years, and then I moved to editorial. So I was really, really lucky. And just that whole, the first books I worked on at Penguin were the Penguin Classics. So just this amazing list, it's the absolute bedrock of Penguin as a publisher. All these incredible books that have, some of them been in print for many, many years, and we were doing new editions of old classics all the time. So I learned so much from doing that list as well. Let's come back to the actual writing and putting together creation of this book. We've talked about the fact that there's a lot of research, but I'd like to know how you managed that research. So obviously you read a billion books, a billion journals, articles, whatever, went to libraries, but you have to collate it somehow, and collate it in a way that is robust and accurate. And you, of all people, a clear lover of footnotes, would obviously want it to be robust and accurate and attributable to things. Yeah. So how did you do that? What system did you have? Can you describe it? Really good
question. Yeah. So I have an A5 hardback book, notebook, first of all. And so the very beginning, it was just my thoughts about each topic. So I had a page on, say, indexing. So I put down, history of the index, go and talk to Richard, who I work with, who's obsessed with indexes, and just kind of fragments of my thoughts about it. Then I would go away and actually start doing the research. And obviously as I've said, a lot of that was done online. And it was a case of just being really thorough about always cutting and pasting the web link into
what document did you use? An app? Did you just use Word? What did you cut?
Just Word. Yeah.
Just Word. Okay.
Now, if I was doing it again, I might find a more efficient way of doing it, because I'm sure there are things out there actually that probably would make this a lot easier. But yeah, that's the level of my technological skill at that time. But it was just a case of being like rigorous, and it, being able to track back sources is obviously really important, and being able to credit them. And then I was also at the same time reading and compiling a bibliography. So, and that kind of thing. I work on bibliographies with authors all the time, many of them much more detailed and involved than my one, actually. And again, but that's kind of like, if you're interested in books, working on a bibliography about books is really interesting. Quite meta.
Very.
Yeah. And this was kind of like one of the things about, writing this book was, it was quite strange in that, I'd be writing about copy editing or copy editors whilst I would also be being copy edited myself.
Yes.
And so it kind of threw up all these little tangles of examples that I could then use in the book. So it was quite a strange experience.
Based on your love of research, did a lot then end up on the cutting room floor, so to speak? And how did you determine what got to stay in?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And as an author, it's quite easy to be self-indulgent. So to sort of think, well, I like this story. I'm interested in this story. I think this is fascinating. Surely everyone else will. And that's where you need a good editor. And when I delivered my first draft, I think my contract said 80,000 words and I was at like 120,000. And I thought, well, this is brilliant. I've exceeded my word count. What I learned is that, as I was talking to one of a structural editor about the process of how you edit books. And he said these 3 words to me, and they are so true. Concision is generosity. So for your reader, being concise is this gift that you can give them. And I wish I'd listened more to my editor, who was cutting quite a lot of what I wrote. And I was resisting it because, when you're the author, that's what you feel that you must do. But if I did it again, I would take out even more, I think, because this idea of concision being the greatest gift that you can give your readers, I think is a really, really important one. So I think the point I'm making is, listen to your editors, because they are able to guide you on when you just go too overboard, when you've got too many stories. So I did take out some stuff. I'm not complete megalomaniac. I probably should have taken out even more.
You tell this story. I can't remember. It was at Mark Twain or somebody who the copy editor. Oh, that's right. The copy editor was told to cut a third of the book or something like that. But the author, and then the copy editor did that and then sent it to the author. But the publisher didn't forewarn the author. So of course the author was horrified. Subsequently admitted that it was a better book.
Yeah, I think and this is like. A big part of my job is this kind of dance between the publisher and the author. And you have to be tactful and you have to be careful. And my freelance copy editors are fantastic. And you have to be really careful in how you approach these things with an author, because it's hard to go to someone that's spent perhaps years writing a book and say, well, actually, this whole chapter doesn't need to be in the book. It's redundant. It's not bringing anything to the reader. And I think that's it's like when you're an author, it's quite a solitary experience. That's what writing generally is. but publishing is this collective endeavor about getting words to be as good as they possibly can be. So it is a bit of a dance between author and publisher. And I hope that mostly authors find that it adds value, that it helps, that it's able to help them find the best way of presenting their words. But yeah, it's a bit, it can be fraught with difficulty. It really can.
So what was the hardest thing about writing this book?
I think the hardest thing about writing it was getting the structure nailed down. I found that really, really challenging. Like I love, I approached each chapter, and I hope the reader feels this too, that they can sort of stand alone. You don't have to start at the beginning of the book and go all the way through to the end. If you want to just start by reading about footnotes or blurbs, you can just head straight to those chapters and they sort of stand on their own. So within chapters, I didn't really have a problem with structuring things, but the idea of how I would bring it all together into a sort of thematic whole was quite difficult, because quite a lot of what I was writing about is quite difficult to define. Like if someone says to you, what does an editor do? It's actually quite difficult to explain. So the easier chapters were ones like print, where there's a mechanical process that you can follow. But the chapter on authors, for example, and how people write, I found really challenging. And also faintly ridiculous, because this was my first book. So who am I to tell anyone how to write anything? But so I tried to look at it in kind of like, through this framework of that, essentially all stories follow the same 7 plots. And there's nothing new under the sun when it comes to storytelling. It's just how we work in those plots that we know that people like to read. So that those chapters were really quite hard, because you're trying to describe something that's really like ethereal and sort of, whereas if you're writing about blurbs, there's an actual physical thing that you can go and look at and people you can go and talk to. So that was tough.
And so what was the most enjoyable part of it? Or was there a particular topic that you just got so into that you thought it was, you got lost in that?
Yeah, I think like it was so, the chapters on footnotes and indexes are kind of my favorites. I was very sad to have to wave goodbye to them because they are so, indexing is its own little miniature world. If you don't have time to read my book, just read the index, because it will tell you, it's this kind of like, as Sam Leith's quote, and I quote him in the book, says, it's a series of magical shortcuts. So you can read an index and get a flavour of what the book is about. And I just love that idea of like, how much value, indexes often get overlooked. I think it's increasingly hard to justify spending the money on them. Publishers don't want to, but they're really, really important. And footnotes, like, I love footnotes. I know some people really don't like them, in which case this book is probably not for you. But it's the whole idea of this sort of slight aside that you can have. And I can't remember who now, someone described footnotes as having this playful and disruptive nature, which I think is probably me, actually. That's how I sort of operate. But I love that idea, is that they sort of disrupt the text just to give you a little playful aside. They're absolutely amazing. And, I just think that footnotes tell you so much about a writer and them as a person. It allows you to kind of express your personality a bit more than the main text does. So I guess those two are my favorite chapters.
I think that people will learn a lot, not only about, fun facts and history of things, but also because you cover things like hyphens and commas and that sort of stuff, but in such a interesting and an intriguing way. I think that it's really useful. And I think the thing that sets what you've done apart from other books who cover similar things, other books are either a how-to, as in here's how to do the comma, or it is about the history of the comma, but they never come to a conclusion. And your book does both, which is what I think is so valuable about it. Was that there's a balance between writing a how-to and also compared to what you've ended up with, which is you've incorporated those definitive elements, but also surrounded it by all of these wonderful stories. Was that always the intention, or
I think that
what?
it's such a great observation, because I think, I mean, for me personally, the best way to learn something is to read about it in a way that's fun and engaging, because then you remember that we have much better chance of remembering the information. And so I am not a prescriptive grammarian. There are lots of people out there that really understand how grammar works, and they've written fantastic books about it. But I do think that, you know, so for example, let's take the hyphen, the N rule, the M rule, which is something that many writers don't use properly
at all. Drives me bonkers.
But once you understand what the difference between the three things is, and why, you know, the fun little story about, you know, them being known as mutton and nuts, which is what printers used to refer to N rules and M rules, that will hopefully stick in your mind. And then the next time you're writing, you think, actually, do I mean a hyphen here, or do I mean an N rule? And make you think about that a little bit. And so, yeah, I think that my natural disposition is that's how I want to learn things, just by having these things illustrated as you go through the book to you, rather than sort of, here's a list of how to use a comma, and you know,
yes.
and also, you know, these things are a matter of taste and style. You know, in a lot of cases there is no right answer or wrong answer, and so that, you know, like James Joyce never really using any punctuation, never using speech marks. It's like, well, you know, his books seem to have done all right without it. So you know, there's the exceptions to rules, and so I think you know, you have to be pragmatic and flexible, you know, in how you talk about these things as well.
So now that the book is out, what kind of response have you had to it? What kind of, you know, feedback or reactions have people given you on it?
Well, I guess like most authors, people are very nice about the book, which is fantastic. I think I'm really fortunate, Valerie, because I've written a book about something that people generally feel very positive about. So most people, we have this, like, you know, when you're talking about books, people's faces light up because they want to tell you about the books that are important to them, or that they're writing a book, or, you know, like we have all these emotional connections with words, which means it's an absolute joy to write a book about books, because people want to get involved in those conversations. And I have so many people that, you know, want to tell me that they're writing something, or how much they enjoy a particular author, or, you know, and so I'm really fortunate. And that's like a lot of the reception has been about this very deep and enduring love that we have for the physical book.
Now, I have to ask you this question. You admit in the book that you have been involved in a situation where 20,000 copies of I think it was, The Importance of Being Earnest, spelt ERNEST as opposed to EARNEST, on the cover were printed. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, I was just looking around then because I thought I might have a copy of it on my desk, because I like to keep it in front of me as a kind of, let me just, no, I don't. Anyway, yeah, so that is what we managed to do, Valerie. So one of the things about writing this book is people want to know about when things go wrong, which is human nature. I would be absolutely the same. Like, there are no stories about everything going right, because that's really boring. And so I think sometimes when mistakes happen in books, people genuinely can't understand how it can happen. And so part of what I do a bit on typos, is to try and unpack the reasons why we end up in these situations. And book covers in publishing, obviously, before they go to print, they get circulated around many different people, many different departments, all who give their thoughts and feedback on the words and what's going on. I mean, the importance of being earnest one is kind of, it is understandable how it happened. It's just, you know, using the wrong form of the word. So it looked like credible on the cover, but obviously it's completely wrong. I think there's a few years ago, there was, in fact, a rough guide to Australia, I think, where Australia was spelled wrongly on the spine.
Oh my
and
God.
Again, yeah. It's like, but when you think about it, it's like when you're proofreading a cover, we used to have like these color printouts of the cover that would circulate. So, you know, based on the lessons I've learned, I would physically move the spine. So I'm reading the words horizontally, because if you try and do it vertically, that's how you can easily miss something.
Yes, yes.
And it's partly because your eye just tells you, like, you know, print has this kind of authority. So when you're looking at something printed and page proofs, your eye naturally assumes that it's correct. And so part of being a good proofreader or working in publishing is really interrogating the words. It's not just kind of switching off and, you know, letting your eye assume that things are correct. You've got to really think about what's on the page in front of you. And I do think, like, you know, I mean, I have to be careful here, because for an author, obviously, the last thing you want in your book are typos. But you're like, for me, I've had to find a way of dealing with the fact that they will happen to me, because it's an occupational hazard in my job. And if I couldn't deal with that, then I couldn't get up in the morning and go to work. So your sort of feelings about a typo do depend on your relationship to it. And it's easy to like laugh at, like, you know, the Oscar Wilde one, because not around anymore, and, you know, that's okay. And he probably would have found it quite funny. But, you know, obviously for an author, that would be catastrophic if you had a typo on the front cover. But in the past, interestingly, so sort of when mass market printing first emerged, typos were a kind of backwards and forwards conversation between readers and authors. You know, they were expected to occur. And there was nothing, you know, particularly sinister about them. They were just, you know, you also couldn't really have typos until you had standardized agreed spellings. And until that happened, there'd be a lot more variation on how anything would appear on a page. So your relationship to typos does depend on where you stand, you know, in the process of making them.
I love how you discussed that there's a relationship to typos. Anyway,
I mean, you know, all typos are not equal. So, for example,
that's true.
Yeah, the worst place to have a typo, obviously, is the cover. The second worst place is in the prelim pages. If there's a typo on page 712 of a 800-page book, it's possibly not the end of the world. We can just correct it for reprints and on we go. So again, I do think, yeah, it does depend on where the typo is and what it is as well.
All right. I absolutely loved your book, as I mentioned. So let's finish up with, what would be your top 3 tips to writers to authors who want to approach a project of this nature that is a non-fiction book about a particular subject? What are the 3 things that you think that they need to have front of mind?
I think for all writers, and fiction or non-fiction, there's this kind of tyranny of the blank page. And I think the absolutely key thing as an author is to get something down on the page. Once you have done that, then you've got an opportunity to go back and start to think about the structure of what you have written and begin the sort of editing and refining process. But until you have been bold enough to get something down, you can't do that. So you just get, like, I think I quote Maxwell Perkins in the book, who was F. Scott Fitzgerald's editor, and this idea of just getting it down on paper and then you can see what to do with it. I think, you know, that to me is like so many people say to me, oh, I've got an idea for a book, I want to write a book. And I'm like, fantastic. What have you done? And they haven't actually written anything down, because I think there's this fear. And I understand that. I'm not criticizing people for that. I think it is a big step to start writing, but you have to do it, because then you can go back and start to shape it
Yes.
and return to it. So I think that's my kind of number one tip. Two, I think, especially for nonfiction, it really helps if you love your subject. I think readers can tell if you're kind of indifferent.
Like if you're writing about postcodes or pylons.
I wouldn't be indifferent. But, so I really must rein myself in for my next round. So yeah, finding something that you are, really passionately engaged in is absolutely key, because your readers need enthusiasm from you. They really, really do, because you've got to lead them on the journey with you. And if it's something kind of really niche and esoteric, I mean, that wouldn't bother me as long as you were really really engaged and enthused by that process. God, number three, I don't even I'm not sure I haven't a number.
How about the writing process then? The actual the actual while you're in the throes of it, sustaining it till you get to a final draft.
I think actually one of the things you need to think carefully about is who to show your drafts to. So I think all writers, well, maybe just me, I love feedback that's positive. And I'm really lucky. So my partner is a writer, and so I was able to be really enthusiastic about what I was writing and then show it to him, and he would always have lots of really good thoughts about how I could phrase things better or structure things in a better way. So I was really lucky, because it was like having my own in-house editor, effectively. And he's actually a better writer than I am, frustratingly. So there's that. But yeah, so I think, but be careful about who you share your work with, because once it's out there, other people's feedback can be helpful, but only if it's the right sort of feedback, if you see what I mean. So I think the temptation to just show it to everybody has to be kind of reined in a little bit. Like, think about where you're going with it, and why are you showing this particular draft to this particular person? What's your sort of hope? What's your expectation about how they can help you improve it?
Wonderful. All right. Well, congratulations on your book, How Words Get Good. I think it's going to become a classic. So thank you so much for your time today, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me, Valerie. I've really enjoyed it.